Every spring, for nearly a century, something happened on the Penobscot River in Maine that most Americans have completely forgotten. 1 billion board feet of timber, floating down a single river, in a single season. To put that in perspective, that's enough lumber to build over 60,000 homes. And it wasn't moved by trains. It wasn't moved by trucks. It was moved by water, gravity, and 5,000 men who knew they had about a 1 in 6 chance of dying on the job. The Penobscot wasn't just a river. It was the most efficient lumber transportation system ever created in North America. More efficient than any railroad. More productive than any fleet of trucks that would come later. And the men who worked it were part logger, part acrobat, part gambler with their own lives. But here's what nobody talks about. This wasn't some romantic frontier operation run by rugged individualists. This was industrial capitalism at its most raw. Private companies controlled the river. They branded logs like cattle. They sorted millions of timber pieces using a system so complex it makes modern logistics look simple. And they did it all while workers died at rates that would shut down any industry today. This is the story of how one river in Maine became the lumber capital of the entire world, how ordinary men became elite athletes just to survive their jobs, and how an entire way of life vanished so completely that most Americans don't even know it existed. Let's start with a number that sounds impossible. In the 1830s, a small city in Maine called Bangor had a population of maybe 8,000 people. By the 1850s, 3,000 lumber schooners were departing from its port every single year. 3,000 ships from one small city, loaded with nothing but wood. Bangor, Maine wasn't just successful in the lumber business, it was the undisputed lumber capital of the entire world from roughly 1830 to 1880. 50 years of absolute dominance, and the engine that drove all of it was the Penobscot River and its tributaries, stretching over 300 miles into the Maine wilderness. Now, you might be wondering how a relatively small river in Maine could outcompete every other timber region in the country. The answer is geography, timing, and a brutal kind of efficiency that only desperation can create. The Penobscot watershed contains some of the largest stands of white pine left in North America. These weren't ordinary trees. White pine grew straight, grew tall, and, most importantly, floated beautifully. A single white pine could be over 200 feet tall and 5 feet in diameter. The British Royal Navy had claimed the best of these trees for ship masts for over a century. But after American independence, all that timber belonged to whoever could get it to market first. And getting it to market was the problem everyone faced. These trees grew deep in the wilderness. No roads, no railroads, no way to move millions of tons of wood except by water. But the Penobscot River flowed in exactly the right direction. It started in the lakes and mountains of northern Maine and flowed south and east directly to the coast, directly to the shipyards, directly to the money. The lumber companies figured out something that would define the industry for the next 100 years. You didn't need to transport logs. You just needed to get them into the water at the right time, and the river would do the rest. But here's where it gets complicated. The Penobscot wasn't one company's river. Dozens of lumber operations cut timber along its banks and tributaries. Hundreds of thousands of logs from different companies all hitting the same water at the same time. How do you keep track of whose wood is whose when it's all mixed together in a churning mass of timber stretching for miles? The answer was log marks. And this is where the whole system starts to reveal itself as something far more sophisticated than it appears. Every lumber company had its own registered mark, a symbol stamped or cut into the end of each log before it hit the water. Think of it like a cattle brand, except instead of burning it into hide, workers hammered it into wood. By the height of the Penobscot drives, over 200 different log marks were officially registered in Maine, 200 companies, all sending their timber down the same river, all trusting that someone at the other end would sort it all out. And someone did. They were called boom companies. Private enterprises that controlled key points along the river where logs could be corralled, sorted, and directed to the right sawmills. The most famous was the Penobscot Boom Corporation, and what they built was essentially a floating maze of timber at the mouth of the river. Picture this. Millions of logs arrive at Bangor over the course of a few weeks. They're all jumbled together. A log from Company A is tangled with logs from Companies B, C, and D. The boom workers have to physically sort through this chaos, reading the marks on each log and directing them into separate holding areas based on ownership, all while standing on floating timber, all while more logs keep arriving. The boom itself was a massive wooden barrier stretched across the river. Behind it, smaller booms divided the water into sorting channels. Workers called boom men used pike poles to push and pull individual logs, reading marks, making split-second decisions, keeping the whole system from jamming into an impossible mess. At peak season, the Penobscot boom handled over 1 billion board feet in a single spring. That's not an exaggeration. That's the documented record. 1 billion board feet sorted by hand or by men standing on floating logs, using nothing but poles and skill and luck. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before logs could be sorted at the boom, they had to get there. And that journey is where the real story begins. The river drive started in winter. Logging crews spent the cold months cutting timber in the northern woods, dragging it by horse and oxen to the banks of the Penobscot and its tributaries. They'd stack the logs in massive piles along the frozen riverbanks, waiting. Waiting for spring, waiting for the ice to break, waiting for the water to rise. When the thaw came, usually in April or May, the drives began. And for the next several weeks, the Penobscot became something between a highway and a battlefield. The men who worked the drives were called river drivers, or sometimes river hogs, and they represented a completely unique profession that existed nowhere else in the world. These weren't ordinary laborers. River drivers were specialists, athletes, and according to the mortality statistics, some of the most endangered workers in American history. At the peak of the Penobscot drives, 5,000 men worked the river simultaneously. 5,000 workers spread out over 300 miles of water, moving an endless carpet of timber toward Bangor. They worked from first light until dark. They slept in temporary camps along the banks. They ate massive quantities of food prepared by camp cooks who followed the drive downstream. And they died at a rate of roughly 1 in 6. Let me say that again because it's important. 1 in 6 river drivers died on the job, not over their careers, not from accumulated injuries. 1 in 6 didn't come home from the spring drive. Those are wartime casualty rates. Those are numbers that would be considered a humanitarian crisis in any other context. So why did men do this work? Money? River drivers earned between $2 and $4 per day, which was premium wages in that era. A good river driver could make more in 6 weeks of spring work than most laborers made in 6 months. That money built homes, supported families, and created a culture around river driving that persisted even as the danger became undeniable. The work itself required a specific set of skills that took years to develop. First, you had to be able to walk on floating logs. Not just stand on them, but walk, run, and leap from log to log in moving water. The logs were wet. They were spinning. They were unpredictable. One wrong step, and you were in the water, which was cold enough to kill you in minutes and filled with thousands of tons of moving timber that could crush you instantly. River drivers wore special boots with short, sharp caulks on the soles. Metal spikes that bit into wet wood and gave just enough grip to stay upright. They carried pike poles and peavies, tools designed specifically for manipulating timber in water. The peavy itself was invented in Maine in 1858 by a blacksmith named Joseph Peavy from Stillwater, just a few miles from Bangor. His design was so perfect for the job that it's still used today, essentially unchanged. But tools and boots only got you so far. The real skill was reading the river, understanding how water moved, predicting where logs would jam, knowing which timber to touch and which to leave alone. Because the biggest danger on any river drive wasn't the cold water or the heavy logs, it was the jam. Log jams happened when timber piled up against an obstacle, a rock, a narrow channel, a bridge abutment. Logs would stack behind the blockage. thousands of them, creating a dam of wood that could stretch for hundreds of yards. The water would back up, pressure would build, and somewhere in that tangled mass was a key log. Remove the right one, and the jam would release. Remove the wrong one, and you'd be buried under an avalanche of timber and white water. Finding and removing key logs was the most dangerous job on the river. The men who did it were the elite of the elite. They'd climb out onto the jam, jumping from log to log over churning water, studying the pile, looking for the timber that held everything together. When they found it, they'd work it loose with peaveys and pike poles, then run across unstable timber while thousands of logs exploded into motion behind them. The men who weren't fast enough simply disappeared. Pulled under by the current, crushed by moving timber, their bodies sometimes found miles downstream, sometimes never found at all. Every spring drive had casualties. Every river driver knew someone who didn't make it home. And yet the drives continued. For decade after decade, men signed up for this work. The money was too good. The alternatives were too limited. And there was something else, something harder to quantify. Pride. River drivers were celebrities in the Maine woods. They had their own culture, their own songs, their own legends. The best of them were known by name throughout the state. Their skills were admired, or their toughness respected. Their willingness to face death every day treated as a kind of nobility. One skill in particular became so associated with river drivers that it eventually became a competitive sport. Burling, also called log rolling. The ability to stay upright on a spinning log while trying to knock your opponent into the water. What started as a necessary work skill became a test of balance and reflexes, a way for river drivers to prove themselves against each other. Eventually, burling competitions spread beyond the lumber camps, becoming attractions at fairs and exhibitions. Today, log rolling is still practiced as a sport, a direct descendant of skills developed on the Penobscot over a century ago. But we need to talk about what was really happening here, because the romance of the river driver obscures a harder truth. This entire system existed to extract wealth from the Maine wilderness at maximum speed and minimum cost. The lumber companies that ran the operations weren't charities. They weren't preserving a way of life. They were businesses, and businesses optimized for profit. River driving was cheap, unbelievably cheap compared to the alternatives. No roads to build, no locomotives to buy, no fuel costs, just gravity and water and men who could be replaced when they died. The river companies paid premium wages because they had to, but those wages were still a fraction of what it would have cost to move timber any other way. And the river itself? It was treated as a free resource. Companies didn't pay for water rights in any meaningful sense. They didn't pay for the environmental damage. They didn't pay for the fish populations destroyed by log drives that scraped riverbeds clean. They didn't pay for the downstream communities whose water supplies were fouled by bark and debris. All of those costs were externalized, pushed onto people who had no say in the matter. The boom companies that sorted logs at Bangor made fortunes. The mill owners who processed timber made fortunes. The ship captains who carried lumber to Boston and New York and beyond made fortunes. But the river drivers, the men who actually did the most dangerous work, they made wages. Good wages for the time, but wages nonetheless. They didn't own anything. They didn't build equity. They traded their labor and their lives for cash, and when the drives ended, so did their income. This isn't to diminish what they accomplished. By moving 1 billion board feet of timber down a wild river using only human skill and hand tools remains one of the most impressive logistical achievements in American history. But we should be clear about what that achievement served. It served capital, it served markets, it served the insatiable demand for lumber that was building cities from Boston to Chicago to San Francisco, and it couldn't last forever. By the 1880s, the great white pine forests that had fueled the Penobscot drives were running out. A century of cutting had depleted the seemingly inexhaustible stands. The biggest trees were gone, the easy timber was harvested. Companies had to go further into the wilderness, into harder terrain, into areas where river driving became more difficult and more dangerous. At the same time, technology was catching up. Railroads finally penetrated the Maine woods, offering an alternative to river transport. Logging railroads could reach timber that was too far from water, They could operate year-round, not just during spring freshets. They could move logs without the risk of jams and the loss of timber that sank or was damaged in the drives. The economics started to shift. River driving was cheap, but only if you had the right conditions: good flow, cleared channels, accessible timber. As those conditions became rarer, the railroads looked better and better. By the early 20th century, the great Penobscot drives were already declining, but inertia kept them going longer than pure economics would suggest. The infrastructure was in place, the skills were developed. The workforce knew how to do this and nothing else. Year after year, and the drives continued, smaller each time, less profitable, more desperate. Companies that had thrived on river transport struggled to adapt. Towns that had built their economies around the lumber trade watched their futures narrow. The last commercial log drive on the Penobscot happened in 1934. Nearly a century after the drives began in earnest, they simply stopped. The timber was gone. The economics no longer worked. The men who knew how to walk on water and dance on spinning logs found themselves obsolete, their skills useless in a world of trucks and tractors. Bangor, once the lumber capital of the world, reinvented itself slowly. The great sawmills closed or converted to other purposes. The boom companies dissolved. The massive timber storage areas became parks and parking lots. Within a generation, most residents couldn't describe how the river driving system had worked. The knowledge simply evaporated. Today, if you visit Bangor, you can find monuments and museums that try to preserve the memory. There's a statue of Paul Bunyan, the mythical logger who became a symbol of the lumber era. There are historical markers that describe what the waterfront looked like when thousands of logs jammed the river. There are old photographs of men in caulked boots standing on timber carpets that stretch to the horizon. But the men themselves are all gone now. The last river drivers died decades ago. Their skills, honed over lifetimes, developed across generations, perfected through trial and death, exist only in descriptions and the occasional demonstration by historical reenactors. The peavey is still manufactured and still used in modern logging operations, but the men who could use it to pick the key log out of a killing jam, who could read water and timber the way a musician reads a score, who could survive odds that should have killed them and often did kill their friends, those men are memory now. 1 billion board feet, 5,000 men, 1 in 6 who never came home. These are the numbers that define the Penobscot River drives, but numbers don't capture what it was like to stand on a floating log in 40-degree water, watching a jam let loose upstream, knowing you had seconds to get to shore before the wall of timber arrived. Numbers don't capture the terror of going under, of feeling logs close over your head, of fighting toward light through a churning chaos of wood and water. Numbers don't capture the pride of making it through another drive, another season, another brush with death. The river drivers of the Penobscot built something remarkable. They created a transportation system that moved more timber than any railroad in America, using nothing but gravity and skill and human courage. They developed techniques and tools that influenced logging operations around the world. They established a culture that produced songs and stories and legends that still echo faintly today. But they also participated in something darker: the clear-cutting of ancient forests, the destruction of river ecosystems, the extraction of wealth that flowed overwhelmingly to owners rather than workers, the acceptance of casualty rates that we would consider criminal negligence today. These things were also true, and acknowledging them doesn't diminish the achievement. It just makes the picture complete. The Penobscot still flows through Maine. You can kayak its waters, fish its pools, camp along its banks, but you won't see what people saw for those 100 years. You won't see the river surface disappear under a carpet of logs. You won't hear the shouts of boom men sorting timber. You won't feel the tension of waiting for a jam to break. That world is gone as completely as if it never existed. Except it did exist. It existed for a century. It shaped the economy of an entire region. It built cities and fortunes and killed men by the thousands. It moved 1 billion board feet of timber in a single spring season, and then it vanished. replaced by trucks and tractors and chainsaws and all the machinery of modern logging that made river driving obsolete. The men who worked the Penobscot drives weren't heroes in any simple sense. They were workers doing a dangerous job for good pay. They made choices constrained by limited options. They took risks because the alternatives were worse. But they did something that required extraordinary skill and courage, something most of us couldn't do no matter how much money was offered, something that no longer exists in any form anywhere in the world. 1 billion board feet, down one river, in one spring, sorted by hand, driven by men who walked on water and accepted death as part of the job. That happened. That was real. That was the Penobscot River Drive. And now you know a story that most Americans have never heard. In the story of how one river in Maine became the most efficient lumber highway in history. How ordinary men became elite athletes and gamblers with their own lives. How an entire industry rose and fell and disappeared so completely that it might as well be fiction. But it's not fiction. The records are there, the photographs are there, the cemeteries with their short lives and missing bodies are there. The river itself is there, flowing clean and quiet now, giving no hint of what it carried for all those years. If this story surprised you, if you didn't know that rivers once moved more freight than railroads, if you've never heard of river drivers or boom companies or log marks, you're not alone. This is forgotten history, erased by progress, replaced by technologies that made it obsolete. If you want to see more stories like this, share about the forgotten industries and impossible achievements and dangerous jobs that built America, subscribe to this channel. We cover the history that textbooks leave out, the work that ordinary people did that we can barely imagine today. And the next time you see a piece of lumber, a wooden floor, a timber frame, think about where it might have come from. Think about who cut it, who moved it, who risked their lives to get it to market. Think about the rivers that carried billions of board feet of timber before any of us were born. The Penobscot still flows. But it doesn't carry what it used to carry. And the men who made it work are gone forever.